Hi.
Hey, how you doing,
How,
Steve?
I'm doing well. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Do you go by just Steve or Dr. Lamos or
Yeah, no, Steve is great. And you go
okay.
by Jeremy?
Yes, yeah.
Nice to meet you, Jeremy.
Is it Lamos or Lamos?
Lamos.
Okay. All right. Is that Hispanic, I'm assuming?
No, no,
No, not at all.
my dad is oh my God. Slovak. It's like derived from Hungarian or something like that.
Really?
Yeah, and my
That's
mom's
from where?
from Poland.
From Poland, right? I kind of thought so just because I heard something like you used to play in some sort of like Polish like Oompa band or
Yeah,
something
yeah,
like
no,
that. Yeah.
my dad played like kind of polka music um as a kid, and so we had sort of he was from the States, but he grew up an immigrant kid, and I've had sort of immigrant like mindset for my especially as a little kid, like, don't take for granted what you hear in the States, that sort of thing.
Right, right, right. So kind of how I do usually do the podcast, it really honestly is just like a free flowing conversation. Obviously, I want to talk about some American football stuff. I'd also love to hear about your teaching, and also as well as some of the uh, just kind of like what you've recently been doing teaching, and you wrote a book and all those great things.
Sure,
So
sure.
so it kind of just free flows. Last time I last interview I did with somebody, we ended up talking for like 45 minutes about like the efficacy of like Christianity and philosophy and like all this stuff. And at the last part, I was like, "Oh, right, we have to talk about like what the band actually was."
Okay, all right.
You're currently residing in Boulder, or
Yeah, we're a little bit north of Boulder, but we've been out here. It'll be 18 years in July.
crazy? What brought you? What brought you to Boulder?
I teaching at the university. It
Okay,
was kind of I had a job for 1 year after graduating at Illinois State, and then came out here in 2005, I guess,
okay.
and really like it. This is a place I'd always wanted to be, and so feel pretty lucky to be here.
Yeah, I feel like I have lots of friends who live in that area, but it was either like we live in the Pacific Northwest, so just outside of Portland
Okay.
area. Yeah. So yeah, I've never visited Colorado, but I feel like they're the Pacific Northwest and Colorado are like in some ways like very, very similar in terms of culture and stuff like that outside and whatnot. So
Very much so. Yeah, it's usually sunnier here though. Although we've had rain for the last week, and my time's in Portland, this feels just like Portland to me at the moment.
it's 91 degrees here.
Oh
So,
God, no, no, I'm sorry. So we've just swapped. Okay, I'm sorry to hear that.
yeah, yeah. It's well, I'm happy to have it because this has been an unusually rainy, rainy winter and spring.
Okay.
So for the area, so it's really rapidly evolving around here. I actually grew up in New Jersey, and then I moved to Bellingham, Washington, which is like right at the Canadian border. And then my wife and I moved down to Portland. We kind of got stuck here after the pandemic, and housing prices were like insane. So we like the area, but it's different than where both of us grew up and stuff like that. But it's kind of
Gotcha.
where our home has been. And where did you grow up?
In the suburbs of Chicago,
Okay.
and then I moved down to Champaign, Illinois, for undergrad, and gosh, I guess it was '92 or something like that, and then I met my wife there. We lived in Champaign basically from the time we met in '95 through about 2004.
Yeah.
So grew up in the burbs, but spent a lot of time in central Illinois before we came out here.
Okay. And when like how did you first get involved with music? Like you're a multi-instrument player. So like what was the first instrument you picked up?
Yeah, we were talking about my dad a little earlier. I started playing the violin at around 4 years old,
Wow.
uh, and then probably started on the trumpet around 8 or 9, something like that. And my dad was kind of played in these polka bands. He was like an accordion and a keyboard player, and he would drag me out. I think the first time I probably played something with him was maybe 8 or 9 years old.
Hmm.
And so I've been doing this, I'll be 50 this year. I've been doing this most of my life
Right.
since about kindergarten. And both of my kids started, so one plays violin, one plays piano. They both started around 5 or 6 as well. So that's just, I guess it's what we do. I don't know if it's a good thing,
Right.
or a bad thing, but it's what
Why?
we do.
I feel like music education in general is a fantastic thing to have.
Yeah.
And the violin at 4, though, seems like an incredibly hard instrument to pick up.
It's not a lot of fun, and for whatever reason, my son was attracted to it around that age too. I think in the States, uh, that's when they start exposing kids to music. And he came home from kindergarten or wherever and said he wanted to give it a try. And I actually was the same situation for me when I was little. And so here we go. But it is, because it's such a tough instrument, it's also good for ear training.
Right.
And I think the piano, my daughter plays piano. I think the piano is good for different kinds of things. And yeah, I'm glad for both of them. And I'm glad to have been roped into this world. Do you play?
Yes, I
yourself?
do. Yeah,
What do
yeah,
you
yeah.
play?
Not violin, but I started out with piano when I was younger, because I feel like it's a very if you learn piano, you can kind of learn the theory around it, and then
Absolutely.
like it's great, right?
Yeah.
And then I just pretty much followed whatever my brother did, because he was like 4 years older than me, and he got into guitar, and so that's what I've been playing since I was 14. And I never learned the technicalities of it, like I wish I had. Like my guitar teacher told my dad one time, was like, he could be really good if he actually practiced. Or
Yeah.
like, you know what I mean? It's like, all you
Yeah.
want to do is learn, songs, and you're like, oh, at the time I was growing up, it's like, oh, I want to learn like, Pearl Jam song, or I want to learn like, the System of a Down song, or like something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas the theory was a little bit harder for me to kind of grasp in that way. Maybe I was kind of burned out from piano too. I don't want to sit
Yeah.
there playing
Yeah.
scales for hours, right?
Yeah. Right.
So it's odd. My brother's actually a really good guitar player, and both my parents don't play music at all. And I think my grandmother played piano, which was like super rare for her, but like she would just sit down and just start playing, and it was kind of crazy in that world. So
Yeah.
so we don't particularly know where it comes from, but we really enjoy it. And now I have a kid of my own, or 2 kids of my own, and so it's going to be fun to see like kind of where they want to go, and what they
Yeah.
want to take, and see if they take to anything.
Sure.
It feels a lot like trial and error with kids, where it's just, like my son is 4.5, and it's like, oh, we just finished t-ball, now we're going to go swimming, like just all this
Right.
craziness.
Yeah.
Are your kids teenagers? Are they
No, 11 and 9. So you have 4.5, and how old is the other one?
1.5?
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So yeah, my split's almost the same. We're just a few years farther down the road.
Yeah.
But congrats. That's
Oh,
great.
thanks.
It's life changing and cool and all those things.
Yes, and stressful and sleep
Yeah, sure.
depriving.
All that part gets a little better. Mine at least sleep now. Yeah. The other
Yeah,
part,
that people keep telling us, they're like, just get him into like kindergarten, life will open up a little bit, type of thing.
oh,
And
totally, yeah.
my brother had kids. Let's see, my brother's 4 years older than me, like I said, but his kids are 16, and my other nephew's 13, I think. So they're like in a completely different stage of life, right?
Right.
So I had always wanted to play trumpet, but it always seemed like an incredible, like, and was trumpet a hard instrument for you to pick up?
Oh yeah. I still I've come. I hated it for. I played it. I thought pretty seriously. Started tinkering with it in college, and then just put it away. One day I said, I hate this dumb thing. I'd always listened to jazz music, and I couldn't kind of get out of my head the people I most liked and how I didn't sound like them. Strangely, then I started playing some around this music stuff in the mid '90s, because it would let me meet bands. A lot of bands wanted
Mhm.
trumpet, or thought they did. So that, I met kind of the braid people through that, and a
Yeah.
lot. everything I did in Champaign started with the trumpet, and then one day just said, I'm going to be a drummer, and you can do that in a college town. And some band needed a drummer, and I found a drum set at a pawn shop, and that was that. But I really hated the trumpet. When I wasn't that big long American football hiatus, I hardly played trumpet at all. And one of the things I'm most grateful for that return to American football has been playing consistently. And now I've actually come to kind of like it. I think it serves a certain purpose in my world, and I feel more comfortable in terms of what I can and can't do with the thing.
Hmm.
And now I appreciate it. It's a kind of a nice part of the day to even play for 15, 20 minutes in the evening is kind of nice.
Who were your
Well, I've made peace with it, I guess.
Yeah, who were your jazz influences that you wanted to
Oh,
sound like?
Miles,
Yeah.
since I was a little kid, Chet Baker, since I was a little kid. Those two people in particular. And now that I'm older, I think I understand that they had roots in popular music, and Miles kind of took it really experimental. And I think Chet Baker was more did the same kind of thing throughout his career, but the time cycled back to him, and so I respect them both in very different ways for they're
Yeah.
very different kinds of musicians, but both made pretty incredible, lasting music.
Yeah, I mean, "A Love Supreme" is crazy record. I I would sometimes put it on when I was like doing a job. I was like, I don't know why I'm listening. Like, this is the most chaotic thing like I've ever listened to. Doesn't really help me concentrate, but like
It's
it's a great album.
and Coltrane is a trip, man. Yeah, that is an amazing record. Yeah, and that track does center in a way that some of the rest of the record doesn't, and yeah, that's that's a powerful album too. That music is so meaningful. Yeah.
I know. Yeah, I've always had an affinity for jazz ever since. Like, I never really got super into it, but like we sit at the breakfast table and we always put on jazz,
Yeah.
and just as kind of like a calming mechanism for us and the kids, and But I always found myself really drawn to it for some reason. Um, yeah, for me, if we're not doing like the experimental stuff, right? Like it's very kind of soothing in a certain way. I started getting more into like samba.
Mhm.
You're kind of what's really awesome, I think, is like you're really introduced to it as a kid when you find out about Peanuts and Vince Guaraldi and the Vince Guaraldi trio, and you're kind of like these childlike things. Like, it was very intentional
Yeah.
for them to kind of introduce that kind of like adultish soundtrack. So I love Vince Guaraldi, and Charlie Brown Christmas is like my favorite Christmas album of all time.
But
Um,
Wynton Marsalis he did the Peanuts music probably 10 years ago, right
oh,
before his
really?
father died. And he has a whole essay on exactly that sort of the role of Peanuts and that kind of popular media, for him as a kid. And that's where he heard his dad's a jazz musician, so he had heard
Yeah,
it elsewhere. But I think his argument seemed to be that he appreciated seeing it on the TV in that way. It made it
yeah,
seem, you know, part of cultural life, pop culture life, I guess. So yeah, you're not alone, I don't think, in saying that. It's a hell of a good record too. I really like that.
yeah,
He
yeah,
sometimes Witten's a little too he goes down paths that I found it maybe a little too intense, but that Peanuts is just great.
you're like, yeah, you're like,
I put it on for my kids all
it's
the
a
time, but
penis.
really, I just thought it was yeah, it's good.
Excuse me. So, I mean, you said you just picked up drums. I find drums to be one of the hardest instruments to play. So you must have had some sort of knack for instrumentation in general, right? Like,
Yeah, I mean, they were around. My dad had a kit at the house, and that I would fiddle around with. But no, I mean, it was very sort of deliberate. I had messed with bass guitar in college a little bit, and as I got into the kind of that indie scene and that emo scene, I I originally bought a bass at a pawn shop or something. But then, yeah, I guess just one day, there was a band that said, "Hey, the guy we was playing drums for us quit," and I was like, "Well, it's kind of punk rock. It's fun." And I could, if nothing else, taking all those years of trumpet lessons taught time. And so I thought I guess my time was okay. And I went to the store and bought books of rudiments and things and thought, well, I can read music anyway. And I have some sense of what a drum teacher would be telling me to do. And like you
Right.
were saying, it's probably 3 hours of rudiments a day. When I had that time, that, and we had no kids and that stuff. That's what I did.
Yeah.
And so I took aspects of the lessons that I had gotten as a young kid and said, well, I'll give it a shot myself. And I would say I'm semi-literate on drums. I mean, there's certain things I can do, and then I don't read music really on drums at all. And I'm okay with that. One of the things I liked about this whole scene was it to have musical training might have been a bonus in some time, and sometimes it was even frowned on, like it was lame. It was lame. But you could be a musician without having to spend all those hours doing those things. And I found that frustrating about jazz, is I just wasn't willing to put in the time to get
Yeah, and
to
it seems
whatever
like
level. And I ended up hating it and myself. And this music was like, yeah, here you go.
right.
You can do something different, and I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, so the transition into kind of like what were you listening to in college? Like what was that, 95?
Yeah, I was there. So I was undergrad 91 through 95, and then in graduate school. And honestly went to graduate school so that I wouldn't have to leave. That Champaign music scene was a big deal for me,
Yeah.
both musically and socially. But that was a time of a lot of kind of guitar rock bands. I distinctly remember the first time I heard Cat and Jazz with Mike on drums at this party, and I was astonished by what that was. So that kind of music started to be real meaningful to me. I thought, wow, I've never been so moved by live music. But there were the kind of 90s Chicago indie bands, Tortoise, Sea and Cake, Duna 44, those kinds of bands were a
Hmm.
big deal. In Champaign, there was a band, Hum was an enormous
Yeah.
influence, and to this day, one of my favorite all-time bands. So, like, as my wife would say at the time, a bunch of dude-based guitar rock. That was my thing. I don't
Yeah.
think indie was terribly diverse. There weren't a lot of voices other than, kind of white dude male voices at the time.
Yeah.
And so I think that was definitely a limitation of that world. Although there was a woman named Elizabeth Elmore in Champaign who did a band called Sarge, and she was doing some interesting things. Liz Phair was kind of groundbreaking at that time in Chicago. And so I've been thinking about that more as I get older, what was both good and bad about that world. But I really did love it. And it was really pretty formative. So Champaign, I owe a lot to growing up in that place and playing with those people. And here we are all these years later. I'm
Yeah, I was
talking
gonna say, yeah. I
ostensibly
mean,
because of that environment.
yeah, and it's crazy to me that Braid's on a reunion tour right now, and um, to kind of see. Did you ever think you'd be doing this? Like, you left American football in 2021, right? Like, did you ever think that you would ever be playing with Steve and Mike? Ever again in a tour, in like a tour cycle?
Oh, no, God, no. So I mean, it's like it's like, I we've all quit that fucking thing one way or another. And I'm returning now after being gone for 3.5 years. I asked to kind of rejoin them, and I don't know. Yeah, no, definitely didn't think any of it at the time. Certainly not in 99. Again, not in 2020 or whenever I decided to kind of pull out for a while. And yeah, it just doesn't seem to want to let us go. So here we
Yeah,
are.
you got to,
But I'm grateful.
yeah. You guys played. I'm assuming. Well, first of all, how'd you get hooked up with Steve and Mike?
It was through Champagne. So I was playing with a different band. We opened for somebody or other, and that was the first time I met Mike. My brother knew those guys. My brother's 4 years younger, like you were saying, you and your brother. Um, he knew them up in the burbs, and I knew about Cat and Jazz. I don't think I'd met Steve till he came down to Champagne, but I think they introduced themselves after some gig or something. Mike started singing then with these two other guys and me that in this other band for a little while. That stopped happening, and then Steve and I started playing,
Mhm.
and then Mike heard what we were doing and was like, "Oh, maybe I could do something with that." And I think that's where American football came from. That was probably 97. And then we were active, in whatever limited capacity from 97 through when they graduated in 99. And
Okay. So,
then,
and you
they
were in
were,
grad school at that time?
yeah. So I was in a master's program in 97. And actually, yeah, I was in a PhD program. So I had different responsibilities, and
Yeah.
they were a little bit younger, but then they went home to live life, and my life was in Champaign. Tracy and I were already living together and all this. Um, we weren't married yet, but we had been together for a few years. So yeah, life kind of diverted, and for 15 years, I'd say hey once in a while, but that was that. And so
Yeah.
when this all came back around in 2013, it was unusual to say the least. I had been here for a bunch of years and didn't really understand how I could make that work with teaching here, and we had just had kids and all this stuff. But so far, it's somehow miraculously it's kind of worked out.
um, so, I mean, you guys, were you kind of, you recorded, what was that? That was like let's say the first record, right? You did an EP and then you did like a full length,
Yeah. Mhm.
right? So what was that recording process like for you? Did you guys studio? Did you demo it? Did you like,
We it's so somebody asked me about this the other day. It was so different because those guys, they would write constantly. So they lived together, and I knew them when they lived together, but I guess only recently I realized or was reminded that they were buddies in high school and lived together all through college, including in the dorms and the whole thing. They would just play constantly, it sounds like, together. But I remember American football, that first iteration, as being so easy for me because they would just bring these things over, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. I'd be like, "Oh, you got to play this, of course. How could I not play this? Whatever that weird shit is."
yeah,
And so it was very Mike never. I remember that Mike never sang. So the lyrical pieces were always a surprise in the studio because he just wouldn't do it. He would not sing during practice, but we would play a lot, at least a couple, 3 times a week. And those parts evolved from those two guys sitting and figuring out whatever they were doing
yeah,
and bringing it over to this other little house, which, we, we just were part a couple weeks ago of buying the house, right? There a group
yeah.
that bought this place. The real American Football House for me is this little place that I lived in and that we would rehearse in, that was near the high school, and it just got knocked down about 3 weeks ago, evidently.
Oh man,
So yeah,
that
on it, March,
sucks.
and a reminder, like that the actual place that I associate with American football in that first record is gone, and I
Yeah,
wouldn't be shocked if the recording studio, which was a garage, might also be gone just because of the nature of how things change. So
yeah,
that was a long time. That was a long time ago. It'll be
yeah,
25 years or whatever. Lots has happened since then.
yeah,
And now I think records get made through Ableton and Logic and Distance, and it's so different. It seems like night and day. I think there are certain advantages to doing things this way, and there are certain disadvantages too, I would say. But that first record was time and place.
yeah. Was it like a 4-track recorder? You guys just set up,
For,
or would you just?
yeah, no, for the first one, we did a bunch of demos on 4-track and even 2-track, but then the the actual studio was 8-track. Maybe it was 16-track ADAT, which, if that is like the worst of all technology. So the fact that that sounds like anything is great. There was this guy named Brendan Gamble who recorded us, a super sweet guy, and he was so. I remember a lot about those sessions. Actually, they were really easy. They were fun. They were low stress. I remember moving the faders together with Mike and Brendan during the mixing, because that's what there was no automation. You just you had fingers and move stuff around. It was kind of sweet.
Yeah,
It's so different now that it just seems like a different beast entirely.
yeah. So you guys, they graduated. You stayed in Champaign, and were you involved musically at all with anything after that?
Totally, yeah, yeah. I was
Yeah.
I was in like 50 bands. That's why I didn't want to leave. I played in everything I could play. Got kicked out of a million bands. I always had a sort of a chippy attitude. Did some solo things. But no, it was just part of being down there. That was
It
everything.
seemed, yeah, it seems. I think people have this kind of lore about that time and place, and especially about Cap and Jazz. Um, and you said before, like the first time you heard Cap and Jazz, there was what was different about it to you, or what drew
Yeah.
you to it?
Yeah, just magic. It was like a religious experience. I've said this a bunch of times, including to somebody who studies religious experience in music. Like it was that maybe the first time I was truly moved like that. I think we were in Danville, to kind of a Rust Belt town, kind of in a VFW or something. And I remember sitting in the back, and I just couldn't believe it was so moving. It was just like it was up to the volume was as loud as I could imagine anything being. Mike was such a dynamic drummer. Tim was a great up in front. Um, yeah, it just felt you sort of feel it resonate with your core. I could feel it resonate with my core. I liked them live, and I liked the records, but the live thing was like magic.
Yeah.
Um, but that what's interesting to me, and I've thought about this not relatively recently. In American football, we got lumped with that Midwest emo scene,
Mhm.
but that Champaign wasn't really part of that. Braid was kind of the one exception to that rule. I think that we were Champaign was more indie music, and American football probably played 3 times in Champaign, maybe. I mean, we just didn't play that often, and so that
Yeah.
the associations come from Mike and that world he helped build, up nearer to Chicago, but it wasn't
Yeah.
really Champagne per se. So when bands would come through, though, the nice thing about Champagne is bands would come through all the time, especially midweek, because we were between Chicago and St. Louis. And so we would get all kinds of cool acts, including Captain Jazz. I saw them in Danville, but also at a bunch of parties in Champagne, other places in Champagne where they'd play. And yeah, it was great. It was a good time. That's what college town should be.
Yeah.
Nothing but free music at shitty house parties, with a bunch of kids, and that's what that environment should look like.
Well, I think it's there's always kind of like these different waves, right? And like people say, "Oh, first wave emo or whatever." But there's, I'm really curious about if you're still tuned in or seeing at all, because Boulder's a college town, and like I, I forget who I was talking about. Like these typical scenes that go on seem to be more disappearing. Like when I grew up in New Jersey, there was my girlfriend at the time would throw VFW hall shows and like things like that, and it was such a young scene. And that seems to have, with the advent of the internet and just like live shows in general, um, there doesn't seem to be a ton of DIY stuff kind of going on. And I'm wondering, like, are you clued in at all to like like what's going on in Boulder or?
A little bit. I taught for the first time in my career writing on music this last semester. And for years and years, especially at CU Boulder, kids didn't ask about this, but increasingly they have. And then, this semester I've had a bunch of students who are interested in music, and including a couple who knew something about, indie music. But we talked about this a bunch. I had 3 or 4 students write papers on exactly this. I think part of it is you and I are a little bit older, and so we're missing some of it. So I think there is some DIY activity maybe that I'll just speak for myself that
Right.
I
No,
just
no, no. Yeah.
hang out. No, but it is also true. I think the internet has changed kind of people's orientation toward this, and they really do think that doing Logic and Pro Tools and things and putting stuff out on Spotify is the route.
Mhm.
But I also think I've had a bunch of students do this, and I'm seeing it. Boulder has the closest thing to a music scene I've seen in 18 years since COVID, and it's 3 or 4 groups of kids who have these houses, and they put on house parties. It turns out a number of students in these classes are in bands that play these parties or host these parties. And I just keep saying again and again, this is the only way to do it.
Right.
There's so much
Yeah.
shit on the internet. It's so overwhelming, just the amount of stuff, and it's so easy to put it out. I feel way worse. You almost need labels to help cull the herd and circulate something.
Right.
So our
Right.
DIY scenes back in the day, you'd have a label, you'd have Polyvinyl or the
Yeah.
million other Polyvinyl like things, and they would help. So this notion that Spotify has democratized music, I think, is BS. I think
Yeah.
it's flooded. It's further flooded a marketplace with no remuneration at all. And I think, I've had so many of my students talk about how overwhelmed they feel. Like, why even bother? There's just so much out there. I don't even know where to start, much less
Right.
why I would pick up a guitar. And it's like, well, because you should be playing parties,
Right. Yeah. You should be
get
playing
loaded
live.
with your
Yeah.
friends and try,
Yeah.
that's what it's for.
Yeah.
Um, and so I'm so proud of these younger people who are actually doing they're building a little DIY scene, it seems like, in Boulder. And they've never gone away. I had a conversation with somebody in Denver. The venues are there, although now they're getting gentrified out. So, that's the
Yeah.
other that's the other double-edged sword of all this is I'm not going to pretend that in 95 we didn't run out VFWs in kind of economically depressed areas of Chicago because, we were middle-class suburban white kids with means who could
Right.
afford to do that stuff and disposable income. And in the meantime, we weren't thinking about, well, what does this mean for local areas? What does it mean for the Fireside Bowl to be
Right.
what
Right.
it was and to be accessible to kids with, white kids with extra income in neighborhoods where, folks were dealing with different kinds of issues. As I get older, I think about that a lot, but I also don't want to, I think you can be critical and honest about a past with also but not dismiss it. Like I was still,
Oh
it
yeah.
was so cool that those scenes existed. And I think today's young kids probably are more conscious of ways that they can do right in these DIY scenes and try to be sensitive to kind of what's going on in communities around them. And I think, I think they might be able to do some of the things that we did, but maybe even a little bit better, even
I
a little
wonder.
more.
Yeah. I wonder how if there's just encouragement needed. Like you can do this. Like I feel like part of the DIY scene was one person saw, right, and then people attended, and they were like, oh, this is cool, like maybe I could do this, right, or like I could get, and then it kind of perpetuates on itself. And like you said, I think there's so many. So I work with teenagers and I'm a mental health therapist. So like the overwhelmingness, right, there's the paradox of choice, right, where it's like there's so much choice that you just get frozen, right, and
Totally.
you're just kind of like I don't know what to do. And there's also the idea that like you used to pick up, like you said, a guitar to go play with your friends, and like there was no like goal of like I'm gonna put this music out and we're gonna put it on Spotify and you're like whatever, you were just like this is something to do in the garage after school, right, or maybe we'll try and play shows where we can get shows and whatnot. So part of me just wonders if there's like where the encouragement is, and if people are being encouraged, or young people are being encouraged to do it.
It's boy, I mean, that's super insightful. I wonder about this all the time. And so I'm talking to these students who are 20, say 21, right? And because there's such an age difference between us, part of me thinks, yeah, I should encourage them. And part of me thinks the worst thing I could do is encourage them because they're gonna be like, what does this
Right.
old guy know? And they're gonna deliberately not want to do it. But I do. I think so. I spent a bunch of time in skate culture, especially younger. I've always sucked at skateboarding, and unabashedly, like I don't skate, but I love that culture.
Yeah.
I wonder though, I was thinking about this the other day, whether that in some ways that's still a little bit easier because at the end of the day, you don't skateboard to put it on Spotify or put your
Right.
videos on YouTube. Or at least most people don't. They skate because it's fun, and
Right.
the sensations of skating and hanging out with buddies are exciting to them. And I wonder if, yeah, maybe that's part of what the band kids need is like, look, you got to treat this like it's a thing, an activity
Right.
first and foremost. Don't even look at stupid Spotify because you're comparing yourself to this industry that exists for any reason but the ones that you need it to exist for. Whereas these kids skating a curb, they're not
Right.
doing it to put videos on YouTube. They're doing it to
Yeah.
kill time or have fun or chase each other around, do whatever they do. So maybe kids do need encouragement, but maybe we need to remind them of for what, And I think house parties are great because if they're fun,
Right.
everyone's
Right. Right. Right.
having a good time and they're meeting new people and they're,
Doesn't matter how shitty the music is. Usually, it's just like, yeah.
but but I, I want I I teach because I teach at CU. We talk about this all the time. Classroom discussion has been markedly tougher since COVID.
Yeah.
Um, Kids who did Zoom for a long time I think, got used to being able to turn their cameras off and tune out as
Hmm.
they saw fit. And now we're back face to face. It's different, and
Yeah.
it's really really challenging. Sometimes they need encouragement to talk. You
Right.
have to have ground rules, and sometimes even give points to people to make them talk, and
Right.
they will, but they're not inclined. And so maybe back to your point, maybe that's where we're at in certain ways with the music thing, is like you have to incentivize kids doing it for themselves rather than, doom scrolling their way through 28-second clips of what 28 seconds probably too long, 13-second
Yeah.
clips of songs, and then comparing themselves constantly to this stream of stuff.
Well, I don't, the part of the thing too is it's like I don't want to be the old man yelling at the cloud, type of thing.
What?
But as a mental health therapist, you can see the mental damage and the studies done on things like social media apps and just like what it does to your brain and socially and like your attention span and everything like that. So even the idea of picking up an instrument, learning to play that, like because it takes time and effort. You have to sit down and you have to be into it. That is something that seems to be kind of like losing a little bit, at least in terms of like some of the people that I see. It's like everything is so instantaneous all the time
Yeah. Yeah.
that there's like a sense of frustration, or they've got their hands in like 10 different cookie jars wondering what's going to work, right?
That's both. I mean, both of those together for sure.
Yeah.
Well, I was yelling at my kids. Oh, want to watch YouTube? I'm like, you don't even have the attention span to sit
Right.
through a program anymore. Like, you can't. I mean, I want you to watch a 22-minute cartoon. Prove to me that you can.
Right.
It's the truth, and my
Yeah.
kids are sharp kids and they read and they do stuff, but this access to things and so-called choice, right? Pretend
Right.
choice, um, is changing how they orient to the world and their attention span and other things, and playing instruments is hard. And so part of the reason that mine do it, I think, is just a kind of discipline. I don't care if you want to do it or not. I mean, I just think at
Right.
some point we all have to learn how to do things that we may want to not want to do in any given day. I could be ruining music for them too, though, right? Because practicing every day could make them never want to do it again. I don't know.
Look, I mean, honestly, I know that people make the joke where they're like, "Well, I know I'm going to put my kid in therapy," so I was like, "I'm going to fuck them up somehow." Like
Yeah,
like it's a given. It's inevitable. Like I'm okay with that.
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
you know what I mean. So if I ruin music, I ruin music. But like,
But you
at least
won't.
I
But
tried.
none of us is going to ruin. Like I've kicked this idea around with some people here, and I'm I'm saying it out loud in part to remind myself that I promised to do this, and life has gotten in the way a little bit. But I've I've kicked around the idea with some other people here at CU Boulder. So our state, Colorado, is really interesting. It's enormously gentrified. Where I live is something called the Front Range. So like Portland, house prices are through the roof.
Yeah.
Normal working people can't afford to be here. We couldn't
Same
afford to be
here.
here had
Yeah.
we not been here for 20 years and able to cycle through houses and do all this stuff. But Colorado is not all that. Central Colorado and Southern Colorado are quite different. They're economically, socially, culturally, linguistically diverse places.
Right.
They're much less expensive at the moment than the Front Range, and I work for an institution that claims it serves the whole state. I would love to get with some people and figure out how to build some 4 DIY spaces. One up here, one in maybe Pueblo, which is kind of central Colorado, one in southern Colorado, Trinidad or somewhere, and get kids circulating across those spaces. And those DIY spaces would be music, they'd be art, they'd be skating or whatever, action sports kind of stuff, but also like whatever kids want to do, and then force them to travel to these different spaces, play for each other, and also mix and mingle and remind them that it's not, the internet isn't your
Everything.
end all be all in terms of interaction. And there's a lot that would go into that, and I could be naive in terms of, I'm not around. I don't know if it would work or not, but I just love that idea because back to, American football and DIY, like to go play in Chicago was a big deal. To drive 2.5 hours and play in some shitty basement was an enormous deal. And to hang out and try to sleep on their floors was an enormous deal. And it was, became all encompassing of social life for a while.
Well,
Uh,
I find it,
maybe kids do need that.
yeah. And what I find mostly is that when you're a teenager and in college and stuff, like there's things you need to identify with, right? Like your identity, like I used to say, I used to be able to tell what a person identified with just by the kind of clothes they were wearing, right? So it would be like, you could tell whether or not this person was into this scene or that scene, or if they were goth or emo or like whatever, right? Just like based on that. Like if somebody had plugs in their ears, you're like, oh, they're probably part of the punk scene, like, you know. And those, I was talking about this with the guitar player from a band called May, um, and the idea of like all these worlds got really kind of meshed together, and so the way people identify themselves like is all meshed together in an oddly unspecific generalized way. And for better or for worse, I don't know, but like now if you're wearing clothes, like I don't know what you identify with, like, right, like it's just either that's part of the style or like what. But I find that community, what is represented as community these days, is really unfortunate. Like how many kids I talk to and they'll be like, well, I told this person blah blah blah, and like I'll just be like, did you say that physically to them or through text? Through text. And they're like,
Yeah.
go have the conversation. Like what you see as community is going on Discord or whatever and like chatting with your friends. Like there's something about connection,
Yeah.
that you need to have in order to be in the same space and to be physically present with people, right? Like it's feels like it's becoming more and more of a lost art, especially with teenagers, but hopefully college spaces or
You would think, yeah, you'd think they might be better. But I think music, I'm just thinking back to all the ways in which, the music scene ended up being challenging for me, right? To the first time I ever met, people who identified, as queer was through music. The
Mhm.
first time I met, or knowingly so, I undoubtedly knew folks when I was younger, but we didn't talk about that. But in
Yeah,
music, we did. The first time I met folks who identified as vegan were in those scenes. The
right.
first time I really had interesting conversations about my white privilege was with kids of color in those scenes who'd be
Mhm.
like, "Don't you see that when you say X, you're doing X and Y and Z, or this pisses me off, and here's why." But they were face to face, and it was all about like, we do love this music,
Yeah,
right? And we're all here, and we're all in some person's basement or VFW and whatever. And it's not. My worry is on the internet, you can throw things out there and then you can retreat, right? And you can be controversial, but there's not this kind of follow up, including when folks are judged. And, hey, you just said something really offensive in a face to face conversation. If folks are interacting with kind of, in good faith, then the next, you pissed me off. Here's why. Here's what I hope you'll do about your pissing me off so
right,
that we can stay friends.
right,
Uh, and I feel like actual music scenes force people together around positivity. And that's the other thing I was spent a lot of time talking about with these CU kids. It's like music is like a lot of other things, except it isn't. It has no purpose. It has no end goal, and it really is rooted in positivity. Even music about shitty feelings is, no one listens to The Cure to feel worse.
right,
They
right,
listen to that music because somehow it's cathartic, or somehow the identification is actually weirdly comforting.
right.
So, music, I think, has a special power, and then I think music scenes have a special power to bring people together, but with an implicit mandate to therefore be together a little better in the future, right? And I'm sorry if I pissed you off, and I'm sorry if I saw the world in a particular way, but let's go to this next show, and then I'll try not to do that, and we
Right,
can
right.
we can kind of move forward together. And
But
man, I really do think it matters, and Spotify sure as hell isn't doing that for people.
Yeah.
You know,
What what
that's where it ends. That's where Spotify does nothing for folks. You need this other piece of stuff to get, you know, to really experience what music is supposed to do for us, which is bringing folks together with a kind of conscience, or a kind of, we will agree to be these kinds of people moving forward because we all value this in the same way.
Yeah, and I think that's that's part of it. It's like if you have a common identifier, right, or a common thing that brings you together, right, you can have those hard conversations. You can see more points of view, and you can say, well, this person. I mean, whether you want to think about it as tribalism or like whatever, when you see somebody as a part of your community, right, and then they're able to tell you about their experience, right, and you kind of have that kind of bonding, right. There's also like a conflict and hopefully a resolution within that conflict, right. But then it's like, I will see you at the next show. Like
Right.
we're all part of we're all part of this, right. And like we we want to figure out, how to move forward through things, and and to genuinely empathize with. So I feel like hearing people's story and attentively listening and what they experience, like I feel like the internet exposes so much, but like the nuance and the experiences of the conversations are highly lost. So then we just all kind of go into these different little bubbles, so like echo chambers, where we're like, well, I don't like how that feels, so I'm going to move over there, instead of being like, no, like we can have conflict, and we can be okay, right, and like we can grow and change, and be exposed to different ideas. And so I see that. And um one of my best friends, actually, his name is Ted. We grew up together, been best friends since like eighth grade. Is a teacher, is an English teacher, actually, at the University of Arizona. He's a creative writing teacher. He also does uh, English 101. Does a lot of like, they're kind of allowed, I think, to just kind of structure that whichever way they want, English 101 type thing.
Yeah, probably so.
Yeah, so he basically does like rhetoric, and he also does like debate. So for him, it's about teaching how to form your arguments, how to talk about things, right, and like make a persuasive argument. Um, and something I just wanted to ask is, because like him and I have had a lot of conversations about this, just in general, but there the idea of college being sold more as an experience, um, than like what he's I don't think he would mind me talking about this, but what he sees is kind of like, and I hope I'm representing his idea correctly, but like academia and college used to be a place where you were like exposed to a lot of different ideas, and thought process, and communication, and all that stuff. And faculty were kind of seen as bedrock. But for him, it feels more and more like college, like the university, at least that he's in, is being sold more as an experience. And like the students are our customers, and like that's like the customer is always right, and somehow we need to kind of like formulate their experiences so that we're not losing. um and I'm wondering if you've seen that kind of shift in academia.
Y- yes, yes, I have. I mean, my campus, I know U of A's campus a little bit. I've never been there, but reputation, we're dealing with a lot of the same kinds of issues. Yes, I think big campuses like the ones that we're both on, in some ways by economic necessity, have had to shift this mindset, but we are also responsible in part, not your friend necessarily, not me necessarily, although I've been administration here, complicit in this. We're competing for, it's an increasingly crowded marketplace, and all these economic terms drive me crazy, but these are part of the
Right.
ways that we talk about campuses. Um, but I want to actually go back now to this music scene. Yes, I think we are having to sell experience. Why? Because we have internet education, and if students really just see all of this as an instrumental way to get some sort of job that they have some only vague notion about, then what the hell is the difference between Zoom classes or
Right, right.
face classes and a college campus? Why would I bother? Why would I spend all this money? And you're hearing from the media again and again, in media accounts about how expensive college is, and it is. I don't know how I'm going to put my own kids through it, and I work for it. Um, why on earth would I spend money to go live in a place for 4 years? This is stupid. So I think universities like ours respond with, hey, we can offer a kind of 24/7 holistic experience that can be healthy. I think if we did a better job of defining experience, maybe that would be okay. The joke on we have a buffalo shaped pool on our campus, and it's the
Mhm.
highlight of every campus tour. That's not really experience in the way that I'm talking about. That's
Right,
experience in the way that your friend's talking about, like this customer thing. Hey, come have vacation here, and if you want to come to class, great. Or we
right,
have,
right.
we have skiing and weed. Those are our two biggest attractions for the wrong reasons on campus too. I like skiing, and I don't know, we know, but whatever,
Right, yeah.
those are experience defined improperly. But a better thing would be, hey, come, this is a beautiful place. I'll just speak for Boulder. This is one of the most attractive campuses probably in the whole world, certainly in the States. But while you're here, why don't you think a little bit about where this comes from, what it might take to sustain this beautiful environment, let's say, or why don't you look around and think, well, who is on our campus and who's not represented? And what would you like this campus community to look like moving forward? What responsibility maybe do you have to make this a little bit more inclusive or interesting place? Why does the music scene here suck?
Right,
why,
right, right.
why do you throw more house parties so that we had vibrant, interesting live music as part of a cool Boulder experience, so that it was as interesting for folks to do that as it would be to go to Vail for the weekend or whatever. I think there are ways to sell the experience as something positive and exciting, but also with responsibility, but not also to. I was going to say this in context of music. You and I, as grown-ups who would do what we do for a living, can have these conversations. But I'm not going to. Hey, you should be part of the music scene so that we can all
Right,
build together. Like that's not. You should be in the music scene because this is cool. Like you
right,
like
right,
front row at concerts and feeling the bass kind of knock your senses silly. You should be attracted to that first.
right.
But just know that someone had to put that on, and all this other stuff happens every time you go to a concert that you really enjoy. And so think a little bit. If you really like this that much, think about maybe how you can contribute to making sure that other people have the same opportunity that you have to have your head blown off by giant bass speakers.
Right.
And that's part of this experience. That's part of how we should be selling this too. Is yes, this should be a great 4 years in your life. Yes, a residential campus like U of A or mine will give you opportunities you'll never have. I wrote an article about this not too long ago. Champaign, I met Tracy in Champaign. I did all my degrees in Champaign. So my personal life, my academic life, all my music comes from Champaign. Those 4 years that became 12 years, those were enormously powerful. I
Yeah,
would not be anywhere near whatever I've become without having been there at that time and that place. It's invaluable. You can't sell it, and there's no University of Phoenix that could ever offer that. That's
right, right,
absolute garbage.
right.
So I should be, my experience is kind of proof of concept that these places and times and experiences can be life altering, profoundly so.
Yeah,
We should be doing a better job in higher ed of thinking about that and then talking about that. So, like in the worst scenario, I was so nervous about teaching writing on music because I thought, man, this is going to be perceived as one of these kind of blow off classes. I think though, when it worked, it was students would come in with a certain mindset about why they would want to take a course like this, and then by the end think, oh, I see, I see differently now. I
right.
see my experience of music as part of something else, and I'm looking forward to thinking about that something else moving forward.
Yeah. You've been teaching for how long?
I've been here 18 years, but I've been doing this, if I count grad school, for 25 ish. So teaching the kind of class your friend teaches, these first
Yeah,
year required comp classes, I've been doing that pretty much my whole career. And so, yeah, we've been at it long enough to feel like I've seen certain things change, certain things stay the same, and can both empathize with your friend's position that, yes, I do think there's a more instrumental mindset now. It's infinitely more expensive than it was when we were
oh
little
yeah,
band.
yeah.
But
Well,
I also think the student as consumer thing is irritating. We can't do our job, and they're not getting as much out of what they're paying for as they should, because the orientation is
Yeah.
wrong to start with in certain ways.
And my friend is a stellar teacher. Say I sometimes have chastised him for being a little too accessible to his students.
Yeah, yeah,
For you know what I mean? Like he's the kind of dude who like all you need to do is email him and be like, "Can we meet about the paper?" And he's there in like 2 seconds. So he's an incredibly beloved teacher there as well. I think it's just been interesting when we talk a lot about this and also issues of mental health and how to deal with that, or and what the constructive ways to deal with that are,
right.
within accessibility, but also a sort of weird weaponization. So like it's funny because when I visit him, which like I visit him like a handful of times, um, and it's like every time I go there, I'm looking around and I'm like what's this building right here? And it's this huge high rise. He's like, that's student housing. There's a pool at the top. He's like, so why would my students ever want to come to class when you can drink and have a pool party up on top there, right? So the university itself, it's kind of creating all this housing, creating all these like high luxury. I think there's even ones like in the hills for students. And he's like, why? I don't understand why they would ever want to come to class. But then he has a certain subsection of students that amazes him, where he runs the speech and debate club, and like he started that, and they're so committed and so you know brilliant at some of the things that they do. And I don't know if your experience is like this, but just growing older, you know, to become it's hard to stay it's hard to stay relevant in this, or just like up to date on certain things as well. Um, and I think past a certain age, like research shows that our ability to kind of, I guess past 40, our ability to kind of like absorb new information and change ideas becomes steadily, decreased on that end. And do you find it do you find it just as easy to connect with students now as you did say 5, 10 years ago?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, no, not necessarily. Uh, at least, but I guess it depends what you mean by connect. I there are certain things that I find much more frustrating. I found it enormously frustrating to that my students weren't saying much in class, and I thought, well, if there's ever a class that folks were going to talk, and it'd be this one, I would think. And it was tough, and I thought, I'm just getting old. I don't relate in the same kinds of ways. Um, that said, though, that some of the writing that I got this semester is some of the best I've gotten in years and years, and so
Mm,
I was trying to wrap my head around that. So if connect means them doing the thing that they're ostensibly taking the class to do, and if I look at these papers and go, these are actually better than a lot of what I've seen, then I guess I've connected with them. It's just not in a way that I found as comfortable. Like I
yeah.
still like to sit and BS with the kids and feel like I was the liked teacher and I liked talking to them. So I don't know, but you're right about that research, and it must be inevitably the case that culturally their worlds and my world are just different.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just part of the natural progression of things, and we older people have responsibility to try. But if you try too hard, they see right through that too.
Right,
So I
right,
mean,
right,
maybe
right.
I suppose if one thing that we would have going for us is get by getting older is a little bit of wisdom to see through our own lives what's been real and what's been fake,
Yeah.
and what's
Yeah.
been worth worrying about and what hasn't. Um, I will say this too, though, in response to pools on rooftops and that sort of stuff. There's a fun book. I don't. You may be interested in this just out of your own edification. I haven't. There's got to be a updated version, but the last version I taught was probably 10 years ago. It's just called "Why Does College Cost So Much?" and it's two economists trying to figure this out. But part of their argument that's really important is yes, colleges are catering to this. Yes, we are making a problem worse. But at the end of the day, if you actually believe that the customer is always right, students themselves and their parents are selecting schools on the basis of this stuff. So
Mm,
to say that universities are causing this are is enormously problematic because they're in certain ways they're responding to what students and parents are telling them that they want, which is pools on the tops of elaborate housing. What they have an interesting chapter that talks about the shift since 1960 in the average size of the U.S. middle class home from 850 square feet to 3,000 square feet. Number of cars, amount of time spent with technology. You know, part of why college costs so much is the infrastructure it takes to have Wi-Fi everywhere all the time,
Mhm.
being updated, and learning management systems and all this. And these are things that, you know, middle class folks in the States expect. Not only do they want, they
Mm.
expect. They choose based on whether those amenities are present in places. And I'm saying middle class because ostensibly that's who institutions like mine and your
Right.
friends are appealing to. Although they should be appealing to working class, they should be appealing to even making it possible for folks in poverty to attend. But they orient toward a particular mindset that is cultural, and so it makes the problem all the more difficult because you know we are in some ways responding to a kind of demand on the part of people who pay these fees, and then it becomes a vicious cycle where we respond to ostensibly what people say they want, and then they want more of what they want, and in the meantime, anyone not in that bubble
Right.
is out in the margins in a different kind of way. So it's a hard. We're getting into it now. Now it's we could be talking about you know whatever. But
Well, I mean, if you don't want to do that, that's totally fine too. Like, it's just,
no, no, this is fun. This is great.
I well, see, I liked because I don't want part of it is I don't want to force a conversation about American football. Quite frankly, these are more fun conversations for me to have, and I think more interesting conversations to
Yeah.
have than like there's tons of information about American football out there that anybody could just kind of like stop up. So I'm not really too
Oh,
interested in
it's all
like
good. That's all good. Of course I like talking about American football. This is these are the things you know as I get older, and it must be the case for you too because we're having this conversation. But nothing's divorced from any one thing is tied an infinite number of ways to the rest of one's life. And
right,
so talk about music and for me has to be also about teaching school, and you can't talk about teaching at a university without being real about what that does and doesn't mean and why, you know, there are better and worse ways. I think we have an obligation to help students understand how to recreate responsibly
yeah,
and how to have a good time, but also in ways that are sustainable and good for them at the end of the day. And
right,
there's so many pressures, including those on the internet, for constant self-stimulation or constant entertainment, but it's not really entertainment and it's not sustainable and it's not terribly healthy.
yeah,
And you being in mental health, you know, you've mentioned experiences that you've had with these things. And I think asking students to think about things they do for fun in something of a serious way, or at least in a kind of honest way, is good for them. And I think that's part of a justification for universities moving forward is we are spaces dedicated to helping students reflect on themselves in ways that we hope are healthy and um, sustainable in a longer term. And if we should be helping them get jobs too, that's great. But part of holding on to a job and part of preparing for jobs that you don't even know exist yet is having the
right,
right kind of mindset and the right kind of attitude toward thinking about your future. And, you know, in American football, I'm 30 years into American football. How could I have known that? You know,
right,
back to one of your earlier question, there's no way to know. That's not why we did it. And my luck and good fortune shouldn't be you know, what's happened to me is pretty unlikely to happen to other folks. Does that mean they shouldn't be doing this? No, in certain ways, you know, my the fact that I get to run around the country and the world and do this should that's the least interesting part of the story, or that's the part that the fewest people should be paying attention to because that's not what it's the mindset and the doing that we needed something to do in college and we did it
yeah.
and we did it with ferocity and with consistency. And the fact that it's paid off in these wonderful ways is a great bonus, but that I would do the exact same things again
Right. So
without those, you know.
did it like did you realize I suppose like the scale of the impact of that music that you made?
No, no, what's funny is, you know, I've been for these 3 years where I said, "Hey, I need some time away from this," was trying to do some stuff for myself, and it's so funny to think about, you know, if I play drums on an American football song, it goes to these places. If I put something on Instagram or whatever, YouTube, I 200 people see it if I'm lucky, right? And so that this stark contrast in my own head of what it means to do music in that context versus do things that are meaningful to me now and that have
Yeah.
no they have no I get depressed about it. I'm 50 years old and I know better. And it's like, well, what is this thing? What is this
Yeah.
magic thing that has all these, gazillions of views? Are they real? Are they fake? Is that important? Is it not? Is it important for me to say, hey, here's this thing. I'm gonna, here's 200 people. If they like it, fantastic. I don't know, but
Yeah.
I gotta do it. If I would quit this in a heartbeat if I could, because there's too much. I've spent a lot of time doing this. I probably should have spent doing other stuff, but I can't. Like this is the day to day. I still practice almost every day for at least a
Yeah.
few minutes, and it's like this is just part of like putting on pants in the morning. If I
Right.
had a different way to be day to day, I would explore it at this point in life because there are certain aspects of this that I almost wish I could shed, but
Yeah.
this is what we do and we all do it. We all have the things that make us who we are. You were mentioning identity earlier. This is it. And so whether I'm polluting, poisoning my kids into forcing them into this musician headspace at a young age, I don't know, but I think all of us we have to figure out how we get through each day, and hopefully it's healthier and sustainable as opposed to not so
Yep.
healthy and not sustainable. And music has been part of that for me. And so this American football having this amazing reach is cool, but I'd still be playing shitty gigs at the local
Right.
bar if that were my only option, at least once in a while, because I have to do it. Like something
Yeah.
about it has to happen.
Yeah. It's part of you. It's a driving force. And it sounds like you've tried to completely understand it, but it's intangible in some ways. Or
It's intangible, and it sounds like you had some deep philosophical conversation with somebody else recently about this. There's this guy in my field who writes about the religious experience in music, and he's a rock critic. He must also be. He seems pretty deeply religious, but he writes about the ineffable all the time, right? This thing you can't grasp, and
yeah.
this attraction to a force or something that you could never possibly understand, but it doesn't undermine the attraction, and it doesn't negate the fact that we need to try to grapple with that attraction and abstraction in order to make sense of day-to-day life. My wife is studying Buddhism on her own, and it sounds to me like I don't know exactly what she's reading, but the things she brings up in conversation sound a lot like that. And
Yeah.
so we it's music must touch some emotional, spiritual, life force nerve in those people who are attuned to it in some way, shape, or form. And I imagine there must be other ways to touch other nerves for people who are attuned to different things. But we all probably will benefit as individual people and as a society or as collections of societies if we can figure out how to use those attractions, how to make those attractions engage with them productively. I don't know what I'm trying to say. Because
Yeah.
if you say,
Well,
I'm going to make the most out of them, that doesn't feel quite right either. But there's like, if you're deeply attracted to some notion or idea or feeling, it's probably a healthy one. And it's probably one that you should try to spend some time with.
have there been any type of like musicians or things that you have connected with on that level?
Yeah. Yeah. You know, uh, Performances that have been otherworldly, starting with Mike. I remember seeing Wynton Marsalis in a performance and just being sort of bowled over by just how it felt like I was transformed. There's a guy named Bill Frisell. Do you know Bill Frisell?
No.
Older guitar player. He's probably in his 70s at this point. I've seen him perform a few times live, and there's something about that guy. He already seems plugged into the next world. The music is just often just kind of solo guitar. I'd recommend it just as kind of music to work to or think to. These folks just God, I don't know. Gillian Welch is somebody I've been listening to a ton lately, and the way that her voice works, both live and on record, is yeah. It feels like a conduit to whatever word it is that we're talking about,
Yeah.
and so that stuff. that stuff is more, the older I get, the more meaning that I value that as much as just about it, as just about anything. Those connections and those experiences. Um, yeah. So lots of folks. Have you heard the new Alison Krauss, Robert Plant stuff? It's not that new
No,
anymore.
no.
Oh my God, that's another set of records. Like, holy shit, what are they doing? So yeah, there's Miles and these people who have meant the world to me for a gazillion years. It's all part of it, and it must be part of what you have no reason to be talking to me. There must be something about this
Yeah.
that does the same for you, right? And so conversing about it is part of how we give back or plug into it in a different kind of way.
I had a very weird spiritual experience with American football.
Really?
Like, yeah, listening to American football at a time in my life where I was really contemplating leaving my community and leaving my. I was going through like a breakup at the time. I was doing grad school down in Seattle, and I identify as Christian. I always have for like a long time, although I consider myself an incredibly liberal Christian, if not, I don't know. Some people might call me a heretic for some of the things that I believe, but um, yeah, I was, and I didn't intend on talking about this at all. But I was in a space where I was like, I don't know, like the backstory is I had moved to Seattle after a bad breakup, and there was this feeling of kind of running away, and I didn't want to do that, but I was contemplating it. I was contemplating moving down because I was commuting an hour and a half to grad school just to stay with this community, and I was listening. I don't remember the name of the song, but there's a part where Mike sings, "Don't leave home," because everyone here feels the same as you. And
Yeah.
like I was literally in a state of like contemplative prayer, like as I was like walking my friend's dog. It's like I just don't know what to do, and I was listening to that song, and I can't say that I was like, "Oh, this is like a divine revelation," but it just hit at the right place at the right time,
Yeah. Sure.
and I was like, "Okay," and because of that, kind of changed the direction of the same person I broke up with. We've been married for 10 years now, and you know what I mean. So like, there's these like qualities or things that kind of happen. I mean, Jeremy Enoch is, I don't know if you know Jeremy Enoch.
Sure.
His solo stuff. I don't think I've ever felt a more spiritual experience than seeing him play live. Just his solo stuff. I had a really fortunate chance to see him in a very, very small venue. Just him, a guitar, and a bottle of wine. And man, that guy is, every musician I talk to who sees him play live just has this weird spiritual experience with his music when he sings. And it's otherworldly. It's just crazy, like, and I live like that's a level of the way that music can touch you in a weird spiritualized type of way for myself in Christianity. It's if I believe that God touches all things and speaks through all that is good and speaks through all that is like beautiful, right? Then I am being talked to in a certain experience, right? And like, so those have kind of been the things for me. And the thing I think about American football, that for people, I think the music tends to be vulnerable and beautiful to an extent, and also it seems like there's a lot of minor chord progressions in there, so like kind of hits on that like emotional aesthetic of like sadness. um but there's something about it that, gosh man, I saw you guys on in 2012, I believe, in Seattle, when you guys embarked on your first tour, and that was a spiritual experience to me too. Like, just, you have these moments where things would come down and you'd be playing the trumpet and so, and it was just, it was otherworldly in a sense. It was just like, man, this is so beautiful. Um, I really wished the people next to me would have shut the fuck up the entire time. But that's that's like, and I saw you guys again in Portland when you put out the second LP, and people would not stop talking the entire time, and it just like ruined it for me. Like, so it's
Yeah.
really hard for me to go to shows now because like people seem to talk through all of them, you know, and so you kind of miss out on that sort of like experience of, you know, just like the music taking over and people being busted. But that's the grumpy old man in me. But yeah, I mean, I that like you're exactly. So, you know, the reason some of why I do this podcast is because I get to talk to people whose music has influenced me and made me feel certain things. And I mean, what better gift could I for myself, you know? Um, and so I was so happy for you to do this, um, you know, because that was it for me. And you seem like an incredibly accessible person as well. Um, so yeah, I mean, like essentially, yeah, you hit the nail on the head, right? Um,
Man, yeah, it means a lot. I appreciate it. It's interesting to hear you say that song too, because that's the song that I always point to as my favorite one still to play. That song, and it's the riff. It's interesting that those lyrics hit you in that way, but that main riff remains infinitely interesting to me. It draws me
mm,
in every time. It's my favorite one to play to still of anything that we do. Um, and it's interesting. So there is something about that song, and I think that song. I think it was written, but I think it's more like it initiates something that's going on, and it allows a certain kind of plugging in. I read this stuff all day long too. This kind of phenomenal musical phenomenology stuff, how the
yeah,
body interacts with music, and that song that song brings to mind some of those issues. It's interesting that spiritually it did something for you at that time. That means a lot that you'd share that with me. I appreciate it, and yeah, that song has a kind of mantra quality to it that I'm glad it helped you in that moment, or it meant.
yeah, yeah.
And I do love playing, and I'm glad that it meant life. You should talk to one of my favorite people in the whole world is Sarah Beth Tomberlin,
Okay.
and I met her because she was opening for us on a tour. So we hung out for 2 weeks, and she rode in the van with us. She was raised she was raised in a quite conservative religious space, and I thought you were going to bring up Bazan. She's buddies with Bazan. I don't know Bazan. I've met him a few times, but
Yeah.
we never talked about these things. But I want to say I hope I'm not speaking out of school. That she has had lots of conversations with Bazan about leaving this spiritual community. Um, she, and I don't want to speak for her or anything else other than to say that I think she's thought a lot about exactly what you were just talking about. She's fun. Some of my favorite music in the whole world. She's also as real as it gets and lets people know, exactly what she's thinking when, in all those ways. Just one of my favorite folks. So I don't know if you can get in touch with her or not, but she just might be a really interesting person for you to reach out to because she's got lots to say about exactly what you were just talking about, choices to stay or leave with communities. I've seen her in print talk about relationships now to her folks as an indie performer,
Yeah.
as an openly queer person coming from a religious tradition where those things, to be queer is as you say, heretical almost. And I don't know that she uses that language or any of that stuff, but I just remember having really interesting conversations with her about community and religious experience and background, and thinking about some of what you just mentioned from those angles. So she might be somebody really interesting for
I'd
you to
love
talk
to.
to,
Yeah.
since
I
you
would love to reach
share
out.
that background in any way. And obviously Bazan spent a career thinking
Yeah.
about this and kind of, it sounds like being in community, leaving, coming back, remaining kind of ambivalent about it. Have you seen the Jessica Hopper book, the first collection of criticism by a living female rock critic. You gotta get.
No.
So Hopper was. I forgot. Jessica Hopper was also Bazan's first. She ran Hyper PR. I think she
Okay.
was football's first PR person too, actually. But she's got some really interesting stuff in that book about Bazan and that whole journey. And then this guy, I didn't mention his name because I wasn't sure if it would be relevant, but he might be super relevant to you personally. His name is Joel Henghartse, Hengartse. You may actually even want to reach out to him. His book is awesome, and he speaks as a Christian, a Christian rock critic, openly Christian rock critic, whose leanings sound like yours, kind of sort of lefty, bordering on heretical. It sounds like even in some of the things that he's written, he's got a hell of a lot to say about this stuff, and a lot to say about indie and rock music and its relation to contemporary, young Christian people.
Yeah.
He might be really interesting to you too. I found that book fascinating, infinitely fascinating, and I've read through it now multiple times. So just more folks that might be
Yeah. Fun. Yeah.
in given what you're talking about might be of interest in terms of you trying to reach out.
Yeah. Um, I was if your wife is studying Buddhism, there's a really great book written by a Buddhist monk called Living Buddha, Living Christ, which is like an amalgamation of I forget who the monk is who wrote it.
I'll
But
recommend it.
yeah,
Sure.
it's really really good, and just how the two spiritual sides emerge. I've so a lot of the people, because like a lot of the people in the scene that I tend to talk to, either there was a whole scene of like Christian punk and emo bands, right? Or just like guys who were like always involved in the church who then just became, hugely yeah, it's a really interesting kind of scene that kind of exploded out of that. And so a lot of them have left the faith. And I find the process of deconstruction like incredibly incredibly fascinating. I find that the idea or the I would say inability to reconstruct to be even more fascinating. Whereas I kind of have this like if you deconstruct something, there needs to be a safer place to kind of like reconstruct. And that's what grad school was for me, was like I was able to take these and I fortunately had a church that was like very open where I could just be like raise my hand and be like, I think that's bullshit. Like I don't, this doesn't make sense to me. Like literally, like I could do that and we just have a conversation about it, right? And so the idea of like the Jenga piece being taken out of like certain faith and tradition and the whole thing falling down was like, well, if you want to play again, you need to like re-put the pieces up, right? And like the process of faith and theology should always be a deconstruction reconstruction, because like that's the game, you know what I mean? Like it's hard to know something that's infinite because because like it's always expanding or it's always moving. So I find that like super interesting, that and that's when I kind of got into a conversation with Zach from May, just kind of about that sort of that process, and just finding other people's kind of journeys. I am infinitely, because I am a mental health therapist, just more I'm more fascinated in these types of talks than ever about really kind of music in general, like, you know what I mean? Because I think that like the little things, the life that's lived is like the most interesting thing, right?
Yeah.
Like at the end of the day, because and that's what I'm finding out more and more as I talk to musicians. It becomes less of this like, what's it like to be on tour and blah 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 blah, and more like what's your personal experience been with this, or what are you doing now, and how does that kind of light a fire inside of you, and where's your wisdom at these types of points, and I'm truly thankful for the conversations. They're incredible.
Yeah, there's I'm thinking of yet another book now too, in light of what you're saying. There's a guy I think he's trained as in religious studies. The name is Ashton Crowley, but he writes about the Black Pentecostal Church
Mm,
and history and the history of music in general, but also of organ music in particular. In and seeing the Black Pentecostal Church as a space of kind of radical critique of racism,
yeah.
potential critique of gender norms and LGBTQ kinds of norms, and spaces where people could at least potentially explore, use Pentecostal Christianity as a space to explore new modes of self and new modes of being, and dealing with racism and other sorts of uh, you know homophobia and other sorts of things. And it seems like through the course of this first book that he inserts himself a lot into the book, and there's some aspect of kind of reconstructing a self in relation to this history. And evidently he was an organist in the church for a long time and left the church for lots of reasons, but is seems to be through the space of the book also trying to make uh, uh, give himself a way to put these experiences back together a little bit differently. Somebody I follow on Instagram, and he seems to be thinking a lot
Do you
about this.
know? Do you know Dr. Cornel West?
Sure, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
Cornell was. I've never met him, but yeah, it's sort of a hero. Yeah, and his kind of the ways in which he invokes, pragmatic philosophy against a backdrop of a certain kind of Christian tradition in the States is really pretty. Just
Yeah,
found.
I mean, he came to my grad school and did a talk. I unfortunately missed it because I live 3 hours away from it. Because I love him so much, but he did a talk on basically like spirituality and jazz. And like I'm so mad that I missed it. But I was so dead tired. I wasn't gonna drive 3 hours up there. um, but I yeah, his thought that might be interesting, just in terms of I thought it was really interesting because I didn't expect that that was going to be his topic. But I mean it was right on jazz and soul and spirituality, and thought that was pretty cool. So if I can find it, I'll send it to you. If I can find
I,
the
I would
transcript of it.
I would love to, and I think in light of what we're talking about, I think that African American classical music, West and other people, that they define jazz in that sort of way. Music in the African American blues tradition is so it's inextricable from spiritual things,
Right.
right? It is music. It's inextricable from the embodied experience of people who were enslaved. It's an inextricable from a kind of history, and it circles back to something we were talking about a little bit earlier. So this music can invite people on many different levels, and it can be deadly serious and deadly. It can be bleak. It can also be beautiful and wonderful, but it operates, I think, from a kind of invitational space where there's invitation and obligation. Like, oh, you like this music, do you? I learned more about U.S. civil rights movement from reading jazz biography and
Mm,
autobiography than I ever did from my classes. And as a white kid who grew up in mostly in the white suburbs, I would be confronted with this kind of cognitive dissonance. Wait a minute, this is what I think I see. Why is
right.
this person talking about this? Or oh, how what do I make of that experience? Right? In what ways am I responsible or not for something that happened to somebody 50 years ago in this
Yeah.
other time and place? But also, how can I be a fan of somebody from this particular time and place and not be honest about the things that they faced,
Right.
and not be honest about maybe a sense in which I might have an obligation to sort of deal with aspects of this in my own day to day.
I think that's kind of
Um,
what isn't that what you kind of dealt with in your book a little bit?
it
Like,
is. I mean, that book is about the history of higher ed desegregation in the states from the late '60s to the early 2000s, including, and it's focused on Champaign. And I don't talk about this so much in that book, but the catalyst for thinking about what responsibilities U.S. higher ed has to all citizens in the U.S. stems from me reading jazz biography and autobiography and going, hey, wait a minute.
Right.
Why do these musicians, why do these musicians who I thought were among the most important folks on the planet, why are they experiencing these things? Why are they talking about experiencing these things? Why is it the case that historically, the people who work in these traditions have faced X, Y, and Z, and how does that fit with what it means to be educated,
Yeah.
or what responsibilities a place like University of Illinois or CU Boulder has to other folks? So, yeah, my love of music, I feel like has forced me to try to come to terms with responsibilities, and that's something I've talked about at different points throughout this conversation. But that doesn't mean it's over, or that
Right. Right. Yeah.
there's plenty. I've got plenty to. We all have plenty to do. I certainly have plenty to do. But I'm grateful that music has been a way, in a kind of tool of invitation. I'm not shocked at all that West would talk about jazz and
Yeah.
spirituality as a kind of bedrock driving force for thought in the U.S., for thought about social justice and racial justice in the U.S. And you can have things that are celebratory, but also deeply, deeply demanding and critical at the same time. That's
Yeah.
one of the beautiful things about any art in general, but music in particular, I would say.
It's probably been incredibly interesting for you to see what in the past few years society has done with some of the uh, uh, critical theories on race and stuff like that, and how that's been weaponized in a certain way.
Yeah, I mean, that I use Derek Bell's notion of interest convergence, and Derek Bell being one of the sort of foundational people in critical race theory, to try to understand how moments of historical change function,
Right.
or what we're actually talking about. We're talking about change, and one of Bell's central arguments is very much that what would appear to be gains for marginalized communities in U.S. society tend to happen with the most sort of frequency and the most seeming impact during moments when also the mainstream feels like white mainstream feels like it has something to gain from this change. And so
Right.
he's asking us to be thoughtful and critical about what we mean by uh, civil rights, what we mean by progress in certain kinds of ways. And I don't.
Right.
Bell is a pragmatist in the same tradition that West is, and Bell is deeply interested in trying to understand how things really work, and how and what real progress looks like, as opposed to sort of images or notions of progress. And I think with George Floyd, and I think with BLM protests in the last few years, where we've been at another moment where you sort of see a deep push among marginalized communities, African American communities, and other, for changes in the way that society functions. Certain kinds of responses from mainstream society that fit or don't with BLM, a level of change, and then a level of kind of receding back, and the mainstream saying, "Hey, wait a minute, not so fast, right? We're willing to concede X, but we're not necessarily willing to concede Y." And so I've been thinking a bunch about that book, and certain dynamics that I thought were interesting when I was looking at higher ed. Now that I try to understand how we're grappling in real time with the demands of Floyd's death and the death of other African American young men since Floyd's death, and what have we been how have we been talking about this, and then how has this Fox News sort of backlash and co-option of my mom. My mom and I are different politically, and we can have good conversations. But she was sort of aghast when I reminded her that, hey, I actually wrote a book 15 years ago using critical race theory. You did what? I said, well, you read part of it.
Yeah.
You know, and and I'm not picking on my mother. She'd
No,
be
no, no. Because what? Because
she lives down the street. She should come box my ears. But it was I bring that up because I think what Fox News has termed CRT is divorced from any functional notion of
absolutely, yeah.
what it is, what it does,
It's a bastardized notion of
what it tries. Yeah, and moreover, deliberately so. This sort of knee jerk stuff that's going on is a deliberate kind of misconstrual of what any sort of critical race theory would ask us to think carefully about history and think carefully about economics with an eye on um, thinking differently in the future. And that doesn't serve the purposes of folks who are demonizing this. But it was one interesting moment. We're like, no, I got to be careful, in the Fox News. Anyway, so
Yeah.
I hope it
No.
wasn't
Yeah.
too much of a digression.
What are you excited about now, man?
I'm excited about I'm working on a book about some of these sorts of things. I get excited. I appreciate very much this conversation. I like doing this sort of stuff, but I'm working on a book that's trying to understand these things. I mentioned uh, that is to say, try to understand what the resonance is between music and writing as rhythmic activities. I'm excited about playing in the band. We're going to go do some stuff this summer overseas, and then do a little bit more. It sounds like maybe later in the year, some things next year. It's exciting when my kids went just to be home and see
Yeah.
what they do. They just had a recital the other day. That was kind of exciting. I'm glad. I was more nervous than they were. I'm glad it's summer because it's a little less hectic around here. I can talk to you for an hour and a half, or however long.
Yeah.
So sorry, we've had this a long time.
No, no, no. I've had like 2, 3. Yeah, I'm good. My kids are at daycare. I'm like,
Oh, all right. So I can chat with you now because it's summertime. This is I've got some research stuff to do, but I'm not teaching in the summer, so I don't know. Life is all right. What are you excited about?
oh man. Just trying to think. I'm excited that my kids are in daycare, so I have a little bit of free
That's
space.
perfectly reasonable. I talk to you. Mine go to school. That's right.
I think summertime as well. I mean, we were just in Maui last week, and so that was like the peak excitement. I was sick though, which was kind of a bummer, but just
Yeah,
being
I'm
able to
sorry to
kind
hear
of,
that.
I know.
It sounds like you're feeling better, but that sucks when you're sick on
Oh,
vacation.
yeah. I mean, I just like downed as much cold medication as I could. So I think I'm excited for the sun. When you don't see the sun for 6 months, like, and that comes out, it feels you forget how rejuvenating that is to like your soul,
Yeah.
just in general. I got my 40th birthday is coming up soon. I have no clue what I'm going to do for it. But I think just being a dad. One thing I really like about Mike's uh, Owen project quite a bit. I wish I could talk to him, but the is that I feel like he nails parenting life in an incredibly meaningful way, like in the mundanity of what it means to be to be a parent and stuff like that. But I appreciate that question. I've been working on some music just at home. COVID really gave me a chance to kind of get back into playing guitar and writing music again because I put that lost interest in that for a really long time. So those are the things I'm kind of excited about, and possibly getting more sleep.
Yeah.
Because I work in the evenings. I work from like 3 to 8 o'clock, seeing people. So that's yeah. And honestly, I'm excited for conversations like this. Like this is really life giving to me in a lot of
Yeah, vice
ways.
versa. I appreciate it very much. This has been fun. There are different flavors of interview. You're a good interviewer too. It is nice
Thank you.
when it, um, you know, uh, even conversation. You put people in conversation, and the ideal is something new comes out.
Yeah.
Something that folks hadn't thought through before, or they make knowledge, as we say in higher ed, together. And this has been the free flowing nature of this has really been sort of fun. There are a couple things I'm going to try to write down for myself. Like, you got to think more about that.
I think like authenticity, right? Like authenticity is found in conversation, and I think we all really, really crave that, in a certain way. And I think that's sort of what the internet has like robbed us of. And so creating intentionality around conversation and sharing of life and ideas. I think one of the things that any of like my atheist friends that I talk to, I'm thinking of one in particular, like we're really good friends, and the one thing that he's always been pretty consistently like jealous about is like the idea of the church in the way that it creates community and the way people find meaning. And I it's increasingly difficult. I I hear and I see, and even for myself, to create community because we're connected in ways that we have never been connected before, but we're also lonely in a lot of ways.
Right.
And kind of going back to some of the music and the scene and like what you were a part of, and that that connection is so needed and desired, in a certain way. I just think people need to figure out ways to make that happen. Eh, But our lives are so easy in a lot of ways too that it's easier to isolate, right? Like, um, I mean, without technology, we wouldn't be able to do this, right? So,
Right, and there would be no American football because we never played, so we never did.
right?
I'll leave you with one quick thing, and then I
Yeah,
better go.
yeah,
I gotta get a couple things done before I go grab my kids. But we so I went to Catholic school as a kid. My wife did the same. We were married in Catholic church. Didn't go to church for a long time. But when we moved here, there's a Methodist church down the street, a few blocks. We live in a little town, couple thousand people, and the only reason that I went is they advertised as bluegrass church. And I'm like, I don't know what this is, but this is a bluegrass town. So we went. There was this killer bluegrass band, and I was like, oh, this is pretty good. And then they were nice and friendly, and they said, oh, you should come again. And we've leveled off into we go kind of when we can.
yeah,
I play trumpet there when they ask, and it's to play trumpet in that setting. Sometimes it's their kind of Methodist hymns, and sometimes it's more kind of day-to-day spiritual stuff, but it's fun. And like
yeah,
I like playing in church as much as anything. People are so appreciative. It's the same 35, 40 people every week. It's a tiny old wooden building. It feels kind of old-timey. My kids come, it's the closest they're ever going to get to church. And
yeah,
it's been really pretty wonderful. And like I'm sort of grateful, and I definitely have two minds about organized religion and this sort of thing, but it's been a positive force for us, and I'm pretty grateful for it. And it's been a nice return to things that have value. And so
yeah.
again, like music has roped me back in a different way, and I'm grateful for it. Um, yeah, and to be able to play for folks, I played at Easter time and stuff, and it's special. It's like
Yeah,
that's very meaningful in a whole other thing, and feels in certain ways more. It feels authentic in a kind of deep authenticity that I'm really pretty grateful for. So, um, yeah, here we all are. You know.
well, I'd like thank you so much for the conversation.
Oh,
It's been wonderful. I when you said yes, I was like freaking out a little bit. Just because of what you know, the music has meant to me in general, and I think it's meant to so many people, right? And to have the honor and the like the honor and the lose my words here, just to have the honor to talk with somebody who's impacted your life or whose music has impacted, I am forever grateful for. So I
and
really
thanks for
appreciate it.
saying that. Thanks for sharing. It means it's very special when you and when folks say, "Hey, this has had value." I appreciate so much that it has. I'm glad it sounds like there are times in life where it just came along at the
Yeah,
right time. That means the world, and to be able to participate in this big cosmic energy in some meaningful way, it's very. I'm grateful and humbled. So thanks for that. And next time we're out your way, I'll
please.
give a holler, vice versa, and then we'll come, and then we'll get you closer to the stage so you can actually enjoy.
If you have if
We'll
you have
hang
time,
out.
yeah, if you have time for a beer, yeah, let's go. I will if you I can email you some of those books too for like with your wife or whatever. And
That'd be awesome. She's
um
all about that stuff. So yes, vice versa. And I would love to
yeah,
keep chatting on email. If there's any stuff that I brought up, I can send you, bibliography stuff too. But sure, let's
awesome.
continue the conversation that
Yeah,
way. That'd be great.
All right. Sounds great, Steve. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jeremy. I really
Have a great
appreciate it.
day.
Yeah, you too. Bye.